You can say that's the whole idea and the whole exciting part of working with the commercial part, because the number of stakeholders have changed a lot. If you are taking, you can say maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was very much going into either the nurse or the doctor who was standing with the products. And now there are so many different new stakeholders in the buying process or decision process. You have, of course, you have the procurement. You have the C-suite, meaning the people who are sitting and having the overall responsibility for the budget on the department. And now the last 3-4 years, the whole ESG team is now coming in and have a very big say about the products coming into the business.
Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. My name is Frederik van Deurs. I'm the CEO in Green Innovation Group. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing Anne Harsmann, who is a commercial professional. She has worked in managerial roles in commercial areas of various MedTech companies in her entire career. She also happens to be an expert on sustainability. And that is quite a unique combination that you see quite rarely. And that just makes me really excited about doing these interviews. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Anne Harsmann. Hello and welcome to the podcast, Anne. It's a great pleasure to have you here. I've been looking forward to this conversation because you have more of a commercial background than most of the guests that we have had previous on the show. So I'm really curious to get to know you, get to know more about your career and the trajectory that have led you here to where you are now, where you see a very strong link between sustainability in healthcare and the commercial side, particularly on the industrial side of things. So I've been looking very much forward to this conversation. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to share a little bit about my experience during the years from the healthcare system, but also how we are looking into the sustainability agenda.
And something I find quite interesting is whenever we have a guest on the show that actually has a background from the hands and feet of the healthcare sector. You have a background as a nurse, so maybe you can walk us through sort of. You have an education as a nurse. You worked a bit as a nurse. What has been your career trajectory, starting and where we are now?
Yes, I started as a nurse, and I really find the hospitals as my second home. I really like to be there. After some years as a head nurse, I was just feeling that I would like to try something else. And that was the reason that I started working in sales. Because you can say that working in sales, you are still deliver into the healthcare system, to the hospitals. And that is another bridge to the patients. And that is what I really like to do, is to bridge the product to the patients. And I was some years in different companies and had the opportunity to be in different management positions. So I have the opportunity to build in the strategies, how to meet the market, how to meet the customers and the patients with their, you can say, what they believe in. And that have changed, you can say. So I have been latest, I have been in Ambo as a Danish company, and I have been in Stryker and in Johnson & Johnson, which is American companies, with the Nordic leadership roles. So that have been my journey so far.
And always centered around making these products work for the users, so the nurses, the doctors, the whoever is using the product at the hospital.
Exactly.
For the benefit of the patient.
Exactly. So that have been, you can say, the commercial part. So meaning that it had been in different kind of sales, in the sales area or the commercial area. So very much about how we could be sure that we could deliver in mind of what the patients and the customers was looking for.
That's something I've always found quite fascinating whenever I talk to people inside the commercial departments of health tech companies, that there's a very deep understanding and respect for the reality of the clinicians, the ones that are using the product for the benefit of the patient, and trying to navigate that space where we're actually not in a sales situation where you need to sell something that the buyer is going to need. It's more like selling toys to a parent that someone else is going to use the product that you're selling, and therefore you really need to understand the end user, but the buyer doesn't actually use the product themselves because there's so many links tied into it that it's usually a hospital system or a healthcare system that is the buyer, and the user is actually a clinician. So as a commercial or working in commercial management, how do you actually sort of divide your attention between the lived reality of the clinician, the need of the patient, and sort of that negotiation space with the buyer that's buying the actual product?
Yeah, and you can say that's the whole idea and the whole exciting part of working with the commercial part, because the number of stakeholders have changed a lot. If you are taking, you can say maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was very much going into either the nurse or the doctor who was standing with the products. And now there is so many different new stakeholders in the buying process or decision process. You have, of course, you have the procurement. You have the C-suite, meaning the people who are sitting and having the overall responsibility for the budget on the department. Then some years ago, it was very much the hygiene nurses coming in and talk about what is the hygiene factor. And now the last 3-4 years, the whole ESG team is now coming in and have a very big say about the products coming into the business. So you can say from the beginning, when I started in the private field, it was very few stakeholders. Today it's a lot, which giving new opportunities for us as a company, but of course also different mindsets for the salespeople who are out there, because they have to manage a lot of different stakeholders who have very different interests.
And they need to be conversational on a lot of different agendas, right? They need to understand the patient livelihood, they need to understand the clinician work life, and they need to understand the procurement language and the KPIs that are put up in the procurement processes. And they also need to be conversational on a wide range of different sustainability topics. Like you said, the ESG staff, so the environmental, social governance, reporting and auditing staff will need some parts of it, and other parts will be tied into the procurement departments, where you're looking at unit economics and total cost of ownership or life cycle costs, or whichever models for doing the financial assessment is being deployed there. So we're really asking a lot of the individuals that are working there. I was thinking, I'm really curious, because you've worked in some major companies in Johnson & Johnson and Stryker and Ambu. I don't know how much you can talk about and how much is actually confidential, but can you maybe share with our listeners a few of the actual products that you've helped sort of getting into the hospitals, so we understand, okay, here there was a shrapnel, here there was a scissors, here there was an endoscopy camera, or whatever you've been selling?
Yeah, I can definitely share that. In Johnson & Johnson, which was before that, it was Synders, which was a company acquired by Johnson & Johnson, become DePuy Synders. So I was in the trauma and extremity field, and I also was in trauma extremity field in Stryker and in the Nordic region. So that was screws and plates to take care of people coming home from the Alps, have broken their legs, their wrist, things like that. So you can say it was very much in the acute field, where you're coming into the hospital, you had maybe a broken wrist, and you have to wait, and you have to have plate and screws in to your body. And to do that, you have, of course, the implants, plate and screws, you have power tools to take care of that. So that was the products that I was working with in Stryker and in DePuy Synders. In Ambu,
so it was actually the tools for. A friend of mine is calling them the meat carpenters. That they can actually patch the patients together and make sure that they have the proper tools to do that job, both sort of the equipment to actually facilitate the surgery, but also the parts that will need to go in there to keep us together.
Yeah, extremely interesting field, I have to say. It was very interesting. It was something where you have a very close dialogue with the surgeons, of course, because they were the one who have to take care of the plating and the screws. They have to be sure about the instruments, and the implants have to set correct for the right bone healing. So that was that part, and in that area we had a lot of discussions with the whole sterile department, because you have to be sure that the products were sterile, that they have space enough. So there was a lot of dialogue about to optimize the stock, to be sure that they have all the different screws, links, a lot of things, and I can talk a lot about that. But that was a very interesting field, because it was so complex, and the surgeons become better and better to do things. And when surgeons and nurses become better, you also need to deliver more and more special equipment.
Yeah, they get more critical. Around when was this?
It was in the years from 2005, and I was ended in strike in 2020. So I was in that field for around 15 years.
I'm sure in 2005, sustainability didn't have much of a say, if any. How did you see that development during those 15 years?
I will say in 2005, there was no say about that. It was much more about there was the new tenders was coming in Denmark because of the regions was created. There was a new focus on being ready to optimize on the stock, because all the products was really take a lot of space. It was also the years where the hygiene become more and more important, because how we wash the things, how we could be sure that it was clean enough. So there was a lot of good initiatives from the hospitals about to make that even better. I think it was about 2016-17 where it's become to have more noise, if I can say it in a nice way, about the sustainability part, about packaging. Because every time you opened a box with one screw, there was packaging. So you have a little bit the discussion about to have one sterile product, or if you have something which have to be washed and sterilized every time. So that was the first time where we start to discuss with. I had meeting with one of our very good people from Region Med, who was really our central Region Central, because they were really the first ones who were really taking this into consideration, and they are still very much in the front about that. So the discussion.
I think you can name her.
No, but Susanne Bagger was the one who was really, and I have very good talks with Susanne Bagger already at that time about what could we do, what kind of future are we looking into? And I think that was really a good starting point. And I think what I see today is that the hospitals have moved very fast, and the industry is moving, but maybe surprisingly, the hospitals have moved so much faster than the industry.
That has surprised me a lot.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And, I think if we look a little bit closer to that timeline that you're sketching out now, and also a shout out to Susanne Bagger, one of the OGs of sustainability in healthcare. The Paris Agreement, where the leaders of the world agreed that we should stay on a 1.5 degree global temperature rise, was back in 2015. And that sort of launched that agreement together with the Sustainable Development Goals, and sort of became a much more marketable agenda in a way. And we saw how companies were starting to sort of step up to grab some of the attention that was there, and some of the limelight that was there. And we saw a lot of companies going out and committing to different sustainable development goals, or SDGs. And we saw companies slowly but steadily committing to science-based targets initiative, and other ways of committing to greenhouse gas emission reductions. But what I found really interesting in that time frame was that very few healthcare companies actually came out in that period, because my assumption is that there's been sort of a raison d'etre that we're we're helping patients, we're improving lives, we're curing diseases, so we're doing enough as is. We don't have to worry about this climate thing. And if we do, we need to be very, very certain that we're not greenwashing, because there's a tremendous reputational risk that frankly just doesn't add up if you have to factor in the reputational risk of saying something that's wrong. It's an industry where precision is extremely important and also second nature to the professionals in it. So do you see any other reasons for why the sustainability agenda has been a bit more slow on the uptake in the healthcare industry compared to other industries?
I think, first of all, a lot of the products we are selling is a lot of years under their way. So from starting to develop, there is a long tradition about develop the product, and it have always been about, first of all, patient health. Second, it started to be about healthcare economic. So it was very much about to look about the healthcare economic, the value-based healthcare.
Maybe can you introduce the concept of healthcare economics and value-based healthcare, just to those that are not familiar with the term?
Yeah, you can say that from the first part, we were out coming with the products, and it was very much about if the surgeon liked it. It was very much personal decided if Dr. Nielsen liked that product or Dr. Jensen liked this product. It was very much personal decided by the clinicians, what they like, what they feel good in their hands. Then we start to have these big tenders coming in the whole Nordic regions. So now it's become to be much more about procurement. It have to be, get value to the healthcare system, which makes very much sense. That forced us as an industry to say, okay, how could we discuss that this was really worth taking in a new product? And that was the healthcare economic part.
So it's kind of going from a clinician says, I want that drill, then the clinician gets that drill, no matter the cost. Then moving into more of a unit economic situation where you have a procurement department that has to buy those drills on behalf of an entire region or maybe a couple of hospitals, and therefore a much larger number of clinicians. And therefore arguing with unit economics became something that you as a commercial professional had to deal with.
Yeah, because the tenders become bigger. There was much more, the tenders become much more where they have to be, mix the competition. Why should you use this company and not that company? And what that was, first of all, because of the quality of the product, of course. It was second, very much about how you could support the clinicians. And then it was the economical part. What is the best price? So at that time, there were nothing about the sustainability part. So at the years, it become the economical part makes sense, more and more important. So it was not only the price of the product, but it was also, could you save time for the nurses or for the clinicians having the things out in the hospital? How could you calculate that you save space on the shelf? How could you calculate in money? So that is a very healthy way to look into the product and to the tenders. So that was something which was a very big thing to discuss in the companies and also in the branch organization. We discussed how we could do that, and then. There was the whole, suddenly it became more and more talk also about the sustainability part. And I think in the beginning, it was maybe also from some of the hospitals, they talk about sustainability, but by the end of the day, it was the economical part winning in the discussions.
Yeah, they had to consider, of course, the economic side of it. They also had to consider patient safety. One thing I find quite interesting in value-based healthcare is also the quality-adjusted life years concept, where you're actually evaluating a solution on what is the patient outcome from using this treatment or that treatment or this tool or that tool. What can we expect from the evidence that's out there, and then making it evidence-based and quality based rather than just looking at price and being price sensitive. So that holistic way of assessing a product.
Yeah, and I think it's still some of the a little bit vulnerable discussions we can have, because especially when we talk about single-use equipment, I think that will maybe be something we will talk later, is the discussion is what is the best thing for the patient, the single-use equipment or the reusable equipment. And that is a discussion which can really give some warmth in the room about discussing that, because it's very much about, it's about evidence, but it's also about feelings, which I think it's also important to have in mind when we discuss the sustainability part.
Yeah, there was I had a client of mine that had an example about a certain implant. Let's just say it was a bone implant, and we talked about circular economy and these implants, and he said, would you really want a bone implant that used to be inside somebody else? And when he puts it that way, I'm kind of going through some of those emotions where I'm considering, would I actually want that? And of course, I'm a bit of an idealist, so I end up naturally concluding that I would be okay with it. But I do understand the complete lack of appeal in that notion to somebody else. So of course that, and I very much agree that people do get quite passionate about single use versus multiple use once you get in there and get into the nitty gritty. But what I also find interesting is that it looks a lot like the writing on the wall is there that for a very long time, the buyers have been asking for single use due to hygienic issues and in order to secure and ensure that there's sterilization on the products. But in the time coming, we're going to see an rapidly increasing demand for multiple use. So how is it fair to navigate that space when we have an industry, the healthcare industry, that has been asking the commercial players to develop single-use devices for the past 20 or 30 years, to all of a sudden make that switch and say, all of your development costs into developing these single-use devices, we're going to ask you to just scratch that and deliver multiple use, even though you've spent the past 30 years mastering the single-use production and delivery of devices. Well, what is your take on that as a commercial person? Because we cannot make that change overnight, no matter how much we want to do it.
No, and I think we know this is a complex area to do business in. And it's continued to be more and more complex. And what I think is very interesting, and I have waited some years, and now it's become more and more certain that the patient preference will come now. Because we have always discussed in Nordics that the patient have no say because they are just coming into the hospital. But now we see that the patient preference will be more and more important. So what do the patient prefer? And that is another stakeholder, which will be an enormous opportunity for the companies to think about how do we talk with the patient? What will the patient choose, both in the hygiene part, but also in the sustainable part? So I think that is something which will become more and more interesting. And that is the reason it's so interesting area to work in, because there is so many stakeholders. But coming back to the thing about doing things, I think the short say is that it's not either multiple or single use. It's a combination about how to work best. The reason for doing single use was that it was much more efficient. And now we're not talking endoscopes, we're talking general single use. It was much more efficient. And I have just been out some days in a clinic as a nurse, being around, just have it in my fingers to feel it. And it's enormous waste production being in a hospital. And they're so busy, there's so much to do, and there's so many things to take into consideration that if you have to have a good flow for the nurses or the doctors to be sure that you are efficient to the patients, how can you do that together with be respect for the sustainability part? That is the whole idea. And I think if you can find the best way to do that, that will also be the company who is really having success, not only business-wise, but also for the value that the hospitals are looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and at the end of the day, what kind of treatment the patients are receiving.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point. Also, looking back at some other episodes we've recorded with Maria Gaden, who's working with sustainability in the central region in Denmark, and has looked into a lot of the different problems that occur in hospitals, and also have made some quite radical and drastic changes that has had a tremendous effect. Well, one of the things that she mentions in one of the episodes is also that, well, if we're going to run multiple use, then we will also have to invest in sterilization facilities. And maybe we will not have the space for that. Maybe we will not have the CapEx budget to run that investment. A sort of intuitive assumption could be that it's probably going to have a good return on investment to use things several times. I mean, that's kind of a common logic that I think is applicable in a lot of cases. But it's not always the case. And what you talked about earlier is the complexity of the time to market in this field is that you need to be absolutely certain that it's the equipment that you're putting in the market is safe and efficient. So when we have spent so much time making absolutely certain that that's the case for the single-use products, we now face a choice where we cannot make the shift to multiple use devices so fast, because we will also need to have the documentation that it is in fact safe and efficient. I had a lot of insights from this conversation, and I would love to dive deeper into some of these topics that we've come across. But if we're just wrapping up, what do you see as the main challenges and opportunities for the MedTech future going forwards in the realm of commercial and sustainability and the intersection of those two?
Yeah. First of all, I think when we look at the use on the hospitals for the multiple use or single use, I think there is a broad perspective if we're talking dress, tolls, things like that, or we're talking implants, if we're talking systems. So it's looking into the products. It's also a lot of different way to think about it, where we could do a lot of things which maybe not about patient safety, but about efficiency on the hospital. So you can say a little bit about what kind of industry you're working in. It's giving different opportunities. But overall, I will say the sustainability part is coming to stay. And it's important for all of us. We are all living in this planet, so it is important for all of us. So what I think we should do is that as an industry, they are doing a lot. What I did an investigation and find out, I think I looked at 20 big companies. They are all doing a lot in the ESG agenda, but they were not telling about it. They were not commercialize what they did. So I think they are doing a lot of things which is in the reports, but they are not telling about it. So I think the big opportunity for the companies is to go out, find the right wording to tell about what they already do. Because one thing is that they do good things. The other thing is that it's also role models. So more and more people start to say, industry are doing that, and if somebody's doing it, we can really escalate it. So we maybe have a little bit the same effect as we see from the hospitals, that suddenly it's moving faster. So I think the opportunity is there, but it's about going in and say, how can we tell this story so it feels confident? And so it's not feeling that greenwashing anything, but feeling confident for the sales to go out and tell about what we are doing in the industry. Because we're doing a lot, but we are maybe not telling so much about it yet.
So to summarize that point, it's about developing a literacy on sustainability in the commercial departments, because typically the story is actually there. It's just about finding it and deploying it. Then I would say developing that sustainability literacy and making sure that your sales force and your commercial department and your commercial staff has developed sort of a skill level in sustainability where they have become conversational, you could say. So they can have the conversation. They may not be experts. They should be able to revert to another subject matter expert inside the organization, but they are conversational. So they do know what scope 1, 2, and 3 is. They do know what ESG reporting is. They are familiar with what Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, is. They know what a CO2 equivalent is and why it's meaningful to use that, and they would know what a life cycle assessment or an LCA, something along those lines. So, they don't feel like they're caught behind in that kind of conversation, but they also know the limits of their own knowledge, you could say.
Yeah, we did 2 years ago, we did a test because we want to do that. And that was a whole process, a whole strategy about finding out what do the customers, and here we are talking about the hospitals, what do they really know? What kind of interest do they have? Then we took that knowledge back and find out how could we then meet their questions from a sales rep perspective, because they have a lot of things already to take care of. How could we go out and meet the customers' questions about the sustainability? And that was a pretty good process, and that was something giving confidence for the sales rep and for all of us, but was also something about to meet the customer questions, which I think is also important. We need to hear from the market what they need and meet them somewhere where we can.
For sure. It's been a great pleasure having you here, Anne. Thank you so much for taking your time for it.
Thank you.
Cheers. Hello, and thank you so much for listening in to this episode of the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. It really means the world to us that you're listening in and that you're sharing the podcast as much as you're doing already. We are the top 5% most shared podcast on Spotify, and that is just a tremendous honor that you think the content is so good that you would actually share it with your network. So thanks a lot for that. Please remember that if you subscribe and rate the podcast, it makes it easier for us to get interesting people on board and have them guest the podcast and share their insights with you. So if you would please subscribe and rate the podcast, that would mean the world to us. Also, if you have feedback for us, we're always really, really happy to receive it, to listen to it, and to improve on the show and to improve your experience with the show. So thanks a lot for listening in. Have a great day out there.